her grimy little fist clenched tightly around the fabric of the stranger's pristine suit jacket. Tears squeezed out of her shut eyes, her voice shrieking with a desperation that cut through the air. "Help me! He's chasing me!" The golden lotus fell deathly silent. The gentle clinking of silverware vanished instantly. Every eye in the room widened in horror. But the man she had grabbed, the man whose dinner she had just interrupted, was no ordinary patron. He was Meksen Jihan, the silent king of the Korean Mafia, a man known to end lives for a spilled drink. And what he did next? It didn't just shock the room, it changed the history of the city. Stay with me until the very end, because this story of redemption will leave you speechless. Before we dive in, don't forget to like this video and hit subscribe. Now, let's go back to where it started. It was a rainy Tuesday evening in the city's most exclusive district. Inside the Golden Lotus, the cream-colored walls glowed under soft lighting, and the room hummed with the quiet murmur of the city's elite. This wasn't just a restaurant. This was Meksen Jihan's sanctuary. The waiters moved like ghosts, knowing to keep their footsteps light and their mouths shut. The patrons knew the unspoken rules. You enjoyed your meal, you minded your business, and you never disturbed the man at the center table. Meksen sat alone, a sharp figure in black suit, eating his spaghetti with surgical precision. He was a man of absolute control. At 35, he had conquered the underworld by burying his emotions deep in his past. His dark, stoic eyes focused only on his meal and the glass of red wine beside it. He believed that in his world, caring for anyone was a liability, a weakness that got you killed. But then, a sound shattered the suffocating perfection of the evening. The heavy glass doors of the restaurant didn't just open, they were practically unhinged as a small figure crashed through them. The noise echoed like a bomb going off. Heads snapped around. The maitre d' froze in his tracks, but before security could move, everyone saw the source of the chaos. A small girl, roughly 7 years old, stood panting in the entryway. She looked a heartbreaking contrast to the luxury around her. Her pale pink dress was filthy, her hair disheveled, and a jagged rip on her shoulder exposed bruised skin. She looked like she had just escaped a nightmare. The diners stared in stunned silence. Some looked away, disgusted by the intrusion. Others whispered, annoyed that a street urchin had ruined their dinner. But Zara wasn't looking for charity. She was looking for a shield. Her terrified eyes darted across the room, skipping over the kind-looking women and the soft-faced businessmen. Her gaze locked onto Meksen Jihan. Maybe it was the way the room bent around him in fear. Maybe it was the cold authority in his posture. Or maybe, just maybe, it was a child's instinct recognizing the only monster powerful enough to stop the one chasing her. Without a second thought, she sprinted across the dining floor, straight toward the most dangerous man in the city. The entire room held its breath. To understand why the events of that night were so shocking, you first have to understand the man sitting at table 4. Meksen Jihan wasn't just a powerful figure in the underworld. He was a man who had curated his life with the cold, unyielding precision of a surgeon. In the Golden Lotus, he was known simply as the Silent King. He didn't just prefer quiet, he demanded a vacuum. The restaurant staff moved around him like shadows, terrified of disturbing his orbit. Meksen was focused on his plate of spaghetti marinara, twirling the pasta around his fork with a rhythmic, hypnotic motion. He hated mess, he hated unpredictability, and most of all, he hated unnecessary noise. A young waiter, new to the evening shift, approached the table to refill Meksen's water glass. The boy's hands were trembling, a fatal mistake in Meksen's presence. As he leaned in, his cuff caught the edge of a silver soup spoon resting on the side plate. Clatter, The spoon hit the floor. It wasn't a loud noise, but in the hushed reverence of the Golden Lotus, it sounded like a gunshot. The effect was instantaneous. Every conversation in the room died. The diners at the surrounding tables froze, their forks hovering halfway to their mouths, their eyes darting toward the corner booth. Mexen didn't shout, he didn't slam the table, he simply stopped chewing. For 5 agonizing seconds, the only movement in the room was the waiter's chest heaving with panic. The boy looked as if he was waiting for an executioner's blade. He knew the rumors. He knew that men had disappeared for showing Mexen less disrespect than this. Slowly, terrifyingly slowly, Mexen turned his head. His eyes, dark and void of any warmth, drilled into the young waiter. He looked at the spoon on the floor, then back at the boy. The silence stretched so thin it felt like it would snap the air itself. Mexen raised one finger. Immediately, the floor manager rushed over, his face pale. He didn't say a word. He simply grabbed the terrified waiter by the arm and ushered him away into the kitchen, vanishing him from sight. Another waiter appeared instantly, placed a fresh spoon on the table, and retreated without making a sound. Mexen returned to his pasta. The room exhaled, but the tension remained. The message was clear. In Mexen's world, there was no room for error. Disorder was a disease, and he was the cure. This was the atmosphere of the Golden Lotus, a fortress of silence built to protect a monster from the chaos of the world. And it was into this fortress, this temple of absolute order, that a chaotic, screaming little girl was about to crash. The peace that Mexen had so ruthlessly restored lasted for less than 60 seconds. He had just lifted his fork for another bite when the heavy glass doors at the entrance were thrown open with a violence that shook the frames. The sound was like a thunderclap in a library. A gust of cold wind and rain swept into the warm, scented air of the dining room, carrying with it the smell of the wet city streets. Standing in the threshold was not a customer, it was a child. She was a jarring, heartbreaking stain on a perfect canvas. The restaurant was a symphony of cream-colored walls, soft gold lighting, and pristine white linens. The girl was a chaotic blur of mud and distress. She wore a sleeveless pink dress that was torn at the shoulder, the fabric hanging loosely over a dirty white shirt. Her hair was plastered to her forehead by the rain, and her chest heaved with sobbing, ragged breaths. For a moment, the contrast was paralyzing. The patrons, dressed in their tailored suits and evening gowns, stared at her as if she were an alien creature. She didn't belong here. She was a jagged tear in their beautiful, expensive reality. But Zara didn't care about their stares. She was running for her life. Her eyes, wide and white with terror, darted frantically around the room. She ignored the maitre d', who was rushing toward her with his hands raised to shoo her away. She ignored the horrified whispers of the diners. She was scanning for safety, for a place to disappear. Her gaze landed on the corner booth. Maybe it was the way the shadows clung to him, or the way the space around him seemed empty and fortified. Mexen Jihan sat like a statue, his fork still hovering near his mouth, his dark eyes fixed on the intruder. To anyone else, he looked like a predator. To a terrified 7-year-old, he looked like a fortress. She didn't hesitate. With a burst of desperate energy, she bolted across the polished marble floor, her wet sneakers squeaking loudly with every step. She dodged a waiter, nearly knocking a tray of drinks from his hand, and sprinted straight for the silent king. Mexen didn't move. He didn't flinch. He simply watched her come. She reached his table and didn't stop. She dropped to her knees, sliding on the smooth floor, and scrambled underneath the heavy white tablecloth. In an instant, she was gone, swallowed by the linens. The room fell into a silence deeper and more terrified than before. Mexen felt a small, trembling weight press against his shin. A tiny hand clutched the fabric of his perfectly pressed trousers. The monster of the city was now harboring a fugitive, and the entire restaurant held its breath, waiting for the explosion. The heavy oak door groaned again. But this time, it wasn't a desperate child who stepped through. It was a nightmare in a cheap suit. The man who entered was massive, a hulking wall of muscle that seemed to block out the streetlights behind him. He was drenched from the rain, his gray jacket darkened with water, plastering the fabric to his thick shoulders. Sweat and rainwater dripped from his shaved head, running down a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in a storm. He didn't just walk, he stomped. Muddy boots left thick, dark smears on the pristine marble floor. The smell of stale tobacco and wet dog rolled off him in waves, instantly polluting the delicate aroma of garlic and truffles that filled the air. The maitre d', a man whose courage was usually limited to correcting table settings, stepped forward with a trembling hand raised. "Sir, you cannot—" The intruder didn't even look down. He simply shoved the manager aside with a forearm like a battering ram, sending the smaller man stumbling into a decorative fern. The stranger's eyes were frantic, hunting. They scanned the room with predatory focus until they locked on to table 4. He had seen where the girl ran. He knew exactly where the rabbit had gone to ground. He marched across the dining room, his heavy breathing audible over the soft jazz playing in the background. The other diners shrank into their seats, terrified to make eye contact, praying they wouldn't be noticed, but the brute had only one target. He stopped at the edge of Mexen's table, his shadow falling over the plate of spaghetti. Water dripped from his chin, landing with a soft plip on the white tablecloth, inches from Mexen's hand. "She's under there," the man growled. His voice was deep and rough, like stones grinding together. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at the space beneath the table, where Zara was trembling against Mexen's leg. "Give her to me, now." The command hung in the air, absolute and offensive. In the Golden Lotus, no one demanded anything of Mexen Jihan. Even the city's mayor asked for favors in a whisper. Mexen didn't look up. He didn't acknowledge the man's presence, nor did he acknowledge the terrified child clutching his ankle. His expression remained perfectly blank, his eyes focused on the stem of his wineglass. Slowly, with agonizing deliberation, Mexen reached out, his long manicured fingers curled around the crystal. He lifted the glass to his lips, the red liquid swirling gently against the sides. He took a slow, measured sip, savoring the vintage, while the monster standing above him turned a shade of violent red. The silence in the room was so profound that the sound of Mexen swallowing the wine seemed to echo off the walls. The intruder's patience snapped. He slammed a fist onto the white tablecloth, making the silverware jump. "I'm not asking you again, old man. Hand over the property." Mexen set his wineglass down with a soft, deliberate clink. He didn't look at the looming giant. Instead, he looked at the empty chair across from him. "Sit," he commanded softly. It wasn't a request. Beneath the table, the trembling stopped. Slowly, a small, dirty hand reached up and grasped the edge of the linen. Zara pulled herself up, her eyes wide with fear, and slid into the chair. She looked like a ghost against the plush velvet upholstery. Mexen pushed his plate across the table. The aroma of basil and slow-cooked tomatoes drifted between them. "She's eating," Mexen said. His voice was low, smooth, and utterly devoid of fear. It was the first time he had spoken, and the sound carried through the silent room like a gavel strike. The brute blinked, confused by the absurdity of the scene. "Eating? She's coming with me." He lunged forward, his massive hand reaching out to grab Zara's thin arm. The girl flinched, squeezing her eyes shut, expecting the pain she knew so well. But the hand never reached her. Mexen moved. It was a blur of motion too fast for the eye to track, a flash of silver and a sickening thud. A scream tore through the restaurant, raw and guttural. The brute staggered back, his eyes bulging in shock. Pinned to the heavy oak table was his hand. A silver dinner fork stood straight up from the back of his palm, the tines driven deep through flesh and bone, anchoring him to the wood. Blood began to pool dark and fast on the white tablecloth, mingling with the red sauce of the spaghetti. The entire restaurant gasped as one. Glasses were lowered, breath was held. The violence had been sudden, brutal, and terrifyingly precise. Mexen didn't even stand up. He picked up his napkin and calmly wiped a speck of sauce from his thumb. He looked at the man, who was now whimpering, staring at his impaled hand in disbelief. "I believe," Mexen said, his voice as cold as the grave, "I said she was eating, and I hate interruptions." The fork was still vibrating slightly in the wood when Mexen snapped his fingers. The sound was sharp, like a dry twig breaking. Immediately, two men in dark suits materialized from the shadows near the bar. They were Mexen's personal guard, the cleaners. They moved without a word, their faces blank masks of professionalism. One grabbed the intruder's good arm, the other grabbed the collar of his wet jacket. With a seamless, practiced efficiency, they hauled the sobbing giant out of the chair and dragged him toward the kitchen swing doors. His boots scraped helplessly against the marble. The doors flapped shut behind them, cutting off his whimpers as if a switch had been flipped. The dining room remained frozen. The guests were statues, terrified that even a blink might draw the king's attention. Mexen stood up. The sound of his chair sliding back seemed to echo for miles. Zara shrank back, pressing her spine against the velvet booth. She pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself as small as possible. She looked up at him with wide, wet eyes, waiting for the anger. She was waiting for the punishment that always followed a mistake. But Mexen didn't tower over her. He didn't shout. Slowly, deliberately, the silent king did something that made the maitre d' gasp audibly. He lowered himself. He sank down onto one knee, disregarding the pristine crease of his trousers against the hard floor. He brought his face level with hers. For the first time in years, Mexen Jaihan wasn't looking down on the world. He was looking it in the eye. Up close, the damage was worse. He saw the purple bruise blooming on her cheek. He saw the tremble in her lower lip. He saw the raw red skin where the dress strap had dug into her shoulder. It was a map of pain that he recognized all too well. He reached out. Zara flinched violently, raising her dirty hands to protect her face, turning her head away. Mexen froze. His hand hovered in the air, not touching her, but close enough to feel the heat of her fear. A muscle in his jaw jumped, the only sign of the rage boiling beneath his stoic expression. He slowly lowered his hand, resting it on the white tablecloth instead. "Look at me," he said. His voice was no longer the cold steel of a boss. It was quiet, urgent. Zara slowly lowered her hands. She looked into the dark abyss of his eyes and saw something she hadn't expected. Not anger, not disgust. She saw a reflection. "Who?" Mexen asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Put those marks on you." Zara hesitated, her small fingers twisting a loose thread on her ruined dress. She looked toward the kitchen doors where the screaming man had disappeared, her eyes wide with lingering terror. He came from the bad place," she whispered, her voice so faint Mexen had to lean in closer to hear it. "He said I had to go back. He said the numbers didn't match." Mexen felt a cold chill settle in his stomach, a sensation distinct from the usual icy detachment he carried. "The bad place?" he repeated, keeping his voice dangerously low. "Where is that?" "The basement," she sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "By the river, where the boats sleep." Mexen's eyes narrowed. The docks. That was his territory. Every crate, every shipment, every illicit deal that happened on the waterfront paid a tithe to him. Nothing moved in that district without his permission, or so he had thought. "Are there others?" he asked, his voice tightening. Zara nodded, a fresh tear sliding down her cheek. "Lots of us. They keep us in the dark. They sell us like the boxes." The realization hit Mexen like a physical blow. This wasn't just a kidnapping. It wasn't a ransom job. It was a farm, a localized, high-volume trafficking ring operating right under his nose, in the heart of his empire. Someone was moving children through his city, using his silence as a cover for their noise. The air around the table seemed to drop 10 degrees. The waiters, who had been watching from the periphery, took a collective step back. They knew that look. It was the look Mexen wore right before a building burned down. He stood up slowly, the movement smooth and terrifying. He smoothed the front of his suit jacket, his face returning to that mask of stone. But the eyes were different now. The void was gone, replaced by a burning, focused intensity. He looked at the maitre d' who was cowering near the wine rack. "Get her a warm meal," Mexen ordered, his voice clipping the air. "Get her a doctor, and get her new clothes. If she sheds one more tear tonight, you answer to me." He turned his gaze toward the rain-slicked window, looking out toward the river district. The silence in the restaurant was no longer one of fear. It was the heavy, suffocating pressure of a coming storm. The Silent King had just found a war he didn't know he was fighting, and the enemy had made a fatal error. They had woken him up. The elevator ride to the penthouse office was a silent ascent, but Mexen's mind was already in the gutter. He stepped into his sanctuary, a room of glass and steel overlooking the city skyline. Usually, this view gave him a sense of godlike detachment. Tonight, the lights of the city looked like sores. Mexen walked to his mahogany desk, but he didn't sit down. He didn't check the ledgers or the phone that was blinking with urgent messages from his lieutenants. Instead, he began the ritual of dismantling the Silent King. First came the watch. He unclasped the Patek Philippe, a piece of metal worth more than most houses, and dropped it onto the desk. Clack. Time didn't matter anymore. Next was the tie. He loosened the perfect Windsor knot, the silk sliding through his fingers. He pulled it from his collar and let it fall to the floor. The top button of his shirt was undone, exposing the throat. The executive was gone. He walked to the wall safe, hidden behind a minimalist painting. His fingers moved over the keypad from memory. The heavy steel door swung open with a hiss of hydraulics. Inside, there was no cash. There were no contracts. There was only a matte black case. Mexen opened it. Resting in the foam cutout was a custom .45 caliber pistol and a serrated combat knife. He lifted the gun, checking the weight. It was heavy, cold, and honest. As the magazine clicked into place, Mexen caught his reflection in the darkened window. For a split second, the man in the glass wasn't a 35-year-old crime lord. He was a teenager in Seoul, standing paralyzed in the rain, while a black car sped away, carrying a screaming girl in a torn dress. He had been too weak then. He had been too slow. He had built this entire empire, this fortress of silence, just to ensure he never heard that scream again. And tonight, the universe had dared to echo it. He wasn't doing this for business. He wasn't doing this for territory. The Silent King would have sent a squad of hitmen to handle a disruption, but the man holding the gun wasn't the king. He was the brother who had failed. Mexen holstered the weapon and turned his back on the view. He didn't need the city's respect tonight. He needed its fear. The rain had turned the dockyards into a blur of gray and black, but the warehouse at the end of Pier 4 was burning with activity. Inside, the bass of cheap techno music thumped against the corrugated metal walls. Men with rifles slung lazily over their shoulders laughed, drank cheap beer, and guarded the heavy steel doors that led to the basement. They felt safe. They thought they were the predators. They didn't hear the engines cut. They didn't see the shadows detach themselves from the shipping containers outside. The attack didn't begin with a shout. It began with the lights. With a unified thunk, the main breaker was severed. The warehouse plunged into absolute darkness, killing the music instantly. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of confused shouting and the racking of slides. Then, the skylights shattered. Mexin's enforcers, the suits, dropped on cables like spiders, their boots hitting the concrete floor in perfect unison. Muzzle flashes lit up the dark like strobe lights. Silenced rounds found their marks with terrifying accuracy. The traffickers fired back blindly, their bullets sparking uselessly against machinery, their shouts of panic echoing in the cavernous space. But Mexin's men were ghosts. They moved in silence, a coordinated wave of death that swept from the perimeter inward. And walking through the center of the storm was Mexin. He didn't run. He didn't take cover. He moved with a terrifying, fluid grace, stepping over a body to fire 2 rounds into a gunman charging from the office. The man dropped before he even raised his weapon. A trafficker lunged from behind a crate, swinging a crowbar. Mexin didn't even turn his head fully. He caught the man's wrist mid-swing, twisted it with a sickening crack, and drove his elbow into the man's throat. The attacker crumbled, gasping for air that would never come. Mexin adjusted his grip on his pistol and kept walking. To an observer, it would have looked like a massacre. To Mexin, it was simply housekeeping. He was clearing the clutter. Every shot was calculated. Every movement was efficient. There was no wasted energy, no unnecessary cruelty, just the cold, hard application of force. He reached the heavy steel door at the back, the entrance to the bad place. A guard stood there, his hands shaking so hard he dropped his keys. He looked up at Mexin, eyes wide with the realization of who exactly had come knocking. "Please," the guard stammered, backing up against the metal. I just work here." Mexin looked at him. The guard saw the same void Zara had seen, but this time there was no reflection of safety. "You're fired," Mexin said. He raised the gun. 1 shot. The guard slumped. Mexin holstered his weapon and kicked the door open. The silence of the basement awaited him, but this time he was bringing the noise. The Silent King had finished his dinner. Now he was finishing the job. 30 days later, the rain had stopped, but the Golden Lotus was just as busy, just as exclusive, and just as terrified of making a mistake. The Tuesday night crowd was back. The cream-colored walls were spotless, the air smelled of truffles and fear, and in the center booth, Mexin Ji Han sat in his usual seat. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than a car, his hair slicked back, his posture rigid. To the casual observer, nothing had changed. The Silent King was back on his throne. A waiter, the same young man who had nearly fainted a month ago, approached the table with a trembling hand to clear the dessert plates. He was moving with the careful, jerky motions of a bomb disposal technician. He reached for a silver dessert spoon. His fingers slipped. Clatter. The sound was identical. It rang off the marble floor, sharp and unforgiving. The reaction was immediate. The dining room went catatonic. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. Conversations were severed mid-sentence. The floor manager squeezed his eyes shut, already calculating the severance pay. The waiter turned a ghostly shade of white, his eyes locked on Mexon's face, waiting for the finger to raise, waiting for the execution. The silence stretched, tight and suffocating, and then a sound broke it. Not a shout, not a gunshot, a giggle. It started small, a bubbling sound of pure, unadulterated amusement, and then it erupted into a full, bell-like laugh. Sitting across from Mexon, kicking her legs in the oversized velvet chair, was Zara. She wasn't wearing a torn dress anymore. She was in a pristine navy blue coat with a white collar, her hair brushed and tied back with a silk ribbon. A smudge of chocolate ice cream dotted the tip of her nose. She pointed at the spoon on the floor, her eyes crinkling with joy. "You dropped it again," she chirped, her voice cutting through the heavy atmosphere like a sunbeam. The room held its breath. A child had just spoken, loudly, in the silent king's presence. The waiter looked ready to faint. Mexon slowly lowered his napkin. He looked at the spoon, he looked at the terrified waiter, and then he looked at Zara. The corner of his mouth twitched. The stoic mask, the face of stone that had terrified the city for a decade, cracked. Mexon smiled. It wasn't a predator's grin. It was genuine. He reached across the table, not to strike, but to gently wipe the chocolate from her nose with his thumb. "Accidents happen," Mexon said, his voice deep but lacking his usual chill. He nodded to the waiter. "Bring her another scoop, strawberry this time." The waiter blinked, stunned, before scrambling to obey. The tension in the room snapped, replaced by a bewildered warmth. The diners slowly resumed their meals, the clinking of silverware returning to the air. Mexon watched the girl kick her feet, humming a tune to herself. The silence he had cherished for so long was gone, shattered by a 7-year-old, and as he listened to her hum, the man who had once ruled the quiet realized he didn't miss it at all.